I'm Mike Benedetti. I am out here on Sibley Farm with Colin Novick from the Greater Worcester Land Trust and Chris Leahy from Mass Audubon. This is a 350-acre property that various groups, including the town of Spencer, are considering preserving as open space. Why is this a great spot?
Well, firstly, you usually don't get a chance to preserve so many acres at one time. And in terms of habitat, having that many acres as one large block is tremendous. A second thing is the variety of habitats that are present here. Everything from forest to wetland to meadow to field. And then lastly, the state has listed this property as being of particular interest for the quality of wetlands.
Awesome. Chris?
Yeah, no, I just underscore what Colin said, say it in a slightly different way, and that is two of the main tenets of land and wildlife preservation are: one, bigger is better. So a chunk of land this big, this much acreage in Massachusetts, the third most densely populated state in the country, is fantastic. And then the variety of open country, sort of grassland and shrubland, as well as forest and wetlands and that kind of thing. That kind of diversity is just key for protecting wildlife and natural habitats.
Chris, can you show us around?
Sure.
What is this field here?
Yeah, so what you've got here, it's quite interesting. One of the things, just by way of a little background, is that, as most people in Massachusetts, certainly in Worcester County, know, small farms are getting fewer. There are not nearly as many small farms. This whole area was a very big sort of dairy area for many years, but gradually, with development, etc., the farms are being sold off for various kinds of development. So this kind of habitat, agricultural land, but agricultural land in some cases that's left for part of the year to go, into this, like this wonderful sort of milkweed field we've got here, is fantastic habitat for certain kinds of birds that, because the farmland is diminishing, those birds are diminishing. Mass Audubon has just published a State of the Birds report for Massachusetts. And one of the things, the groups of birds that are in biggest trouble are grassland birds and birds of sort of shrubby areas. What are those birds? Those are farmland birds. Things like eastern meadowlark. This used to be one of our common roadside birds. American kestrel. Again, a common bird that you'd see on the phone wires. These birds are declining dramatically. And it is this kind of habitat that they require. And so as this kind of habitat declines, those birds decline as well. So to have areas of agricultural land that continue to be managed under agricultural restriction or whatever for this kind of open country is just fabulous for birds and all the other kinds of organisms, plants and animals that live in these what the scientists call successional habitats. If we just let this go for, just didn't do anything to it, didn't mow it for hay or whatever, it would eventually return to forest, like pretty much every place else in Massachusetts and New England. So you have to manage it, you have to keep it open, which was done naturally with farming, but it's critical if we want to maintain the populations of those sort of open country species.
Is this milkweed out here?
Okay, so this field, again, it's just a field, but fields are a kind of habitat. You want to call them something fancy like grassland or whatever, and they're filled with all kinds of plants that are essential to the wildlife and stuff that lives here. So this is milkweed. Pretty much everybody knows about milkweed, and at this time of year,
flying off
this is what it's doing. These are the seeds on its little sort of parachutes. Okay, and this is, of course, seed dispersal. This is the way the milkweeds get to, spread their seeds around, etc. But when this is, green, when it's in leaf, etc., it's the food plant for monarch butterflies, which most people have some familiarity with these days. These are these amazing migratory butterflies. They grow up, so to speak. They lay their eggs on the milkweed. The eggs hatch into caterpillars, beautiful sort of tiger-striped caterpillars. Those caterpillars pupate, make a little pupa. Those hatch out into monarchs, and the last generation of those monarchs goes from here in Spencer and flies to Mexico, to the highlands of Mexico, to the sacred fir forest in the mountains of Mexico. They overwinter there, the same ones that hatched out here in Spencer, and then they start back in like February and March. They stop along the way to breed, just like I described before, and then their grandchildren or great-grandchildren arrive back here in Spencer, and the whole process starts over again. I didn't make that up. That's the truth. That's what actually sort of happens. So that's the kind of little miracle that's happening all over. And if we didn't have these open fields, milkweed butterflies, at least in this part of the world, would diminish. And we're losing this kind of open habitat all throughout New England, all throughout the Northeast, because of the loss of small farms and things like that. These grasses, again, you say, well, it's just grass, what's the big deal? But again, these grasses are important food plants for a whole bunch of butterflies. There are a bunch of beautiful little yellow butterflies called skippers, almost all of which feed on grasses and sedges. So in one sense, you're looking at cow food, pasturage, or looking at hayfield, but you're also looking at an ecosystem, a grassland ecosystem.
What I love is if you talk to people who are middle-aged, they'll talk about growing up and there were meadows and fields everywhere, and everybody will talk about it. And you'll get together, and one of the first things that is just easy and obvious for them to be able to explain is that nowadays, all the meadows and fields that they remember from their childhood have gone away.
Yep. Yeah, and we get the same kind of at Mass Audubon. There are people who have these sort of memories of certain kinds of birds. We're talking about these open country birds, and we have a project to look at the decline of whippoorwills. Now, whippoorwill is kind of the voice of the night, the country voice of the night. And again, people of a certain age remember, oh yeah, especially in this neck of the woods, oh yeah, I remember, evening would come and the whippoorwills would start calling and we'd hear them everywhere, and we don't hear them anymore. Well, that's partly because, the habitat that whippoorwills need, this open country, the fields that you were talking about, aren't here anymore. It may be from other causes as well. Whippoorwills are ground nesters. They nest on the ground, and so they're particularly vulnerable to this great increase we've had in things like skunks and raccoons and feral cats that, the whippoorwills become sort of easy prey for. But really, it's the sort of that change in the landscape that people who pay a bit of attention kind of realize is happening, and it's very, very real. So to protect an area like this, former farmland, for all those qualities is pretty important.
Are these game trails through here?
Yeah, these are deer trails.
Oh, deer.
Yep.
Cool. What is this?
Can you see that? Okay, so
Yeah.
this is, I'm holding him very, very delicately. I'm not destroying him.
Okay.
You can see he's still quite alive. And this is something called a clouded sulfur.
Okay.
It's one of our sort of common butterflies. They feed and nectar. They're larvae. The caterpillar eats various kinds of legumes, pea family things, etc.
Huh.
And then the adults will nectar on all kinds of things. These flying around. This is October 10th, so this is the last brood of the season for these guys, and they're feeding on, the last of the sort of the red clover that are here in this field, etc. So this is one of about 108 species of butterflies that breed in Massachusetts. And again, this kind of habitat is critical for them. Most butterflies are not forest critters. There are a few forest butterflies, but most of them are critters of open fields. They feed on, some tree species, but mostly trees like cherry that often occur at the edges of fields and things like that. So again, lose fields, lose open country habitats, and we lose butterflies.
They're just kind of bopping around the top of the weeds there.
Exactly, yeah. So this is early October. Most of the warblers, the migrant warblers, have kind of moved through. There's kind of a late movement of certain species. There's a species that we might see today called yellow rump warbler, which gets common at this time of year. But this is sparrow season. So at this time of year, I was out the other day in my own neighborhood and had 7 different kinds of sparrows. This is sparrow time. And this kind of weedy field is another one of the huge values of this kind of open country. These weedy fields are critical feeding areas for sparrows, like the ones that are in here eating this goldenrod seed right now. So great for bird watching, but perhaps more importantly, critical habitat as these sparrows move through and migrate. The sparrow I get a glimpse of here is a white-throated sparrow. That's a sparrow that does nest in Massachusetts. Very pretty bird. The brightest males have a bright white throat and white crown with black stripes and a big yellow spot near the bill. And they also nest in sort of scrubby habitat at forest edge. And because, again, this habitat is declining in Massachusetts, that species, the white-throated sparrow, is also declining. But it's still a common migrant, and at this time of year, you can still find sometimes on a good morning dozens of them in places like this.
And where we are right here, the field is turning into the forest.
Exactly. We tend to think of this as kind of the end of one thing and the beginning of another, and it is, but what we tend to overlook often is what the ecologists call an ecotone. And an ecotone is a transition area between the grassland or the shrubland and the forest. And the ecotone tends to have its own special deal. It tends to be richer in species than either the forest or the grassland. And that's because they get species from the forest, and they get species from the grassland, but they also get species that really like that sort of middle ground. So they tend to be very rich places, and that's yet another value of having openings like this that then butt up against the forest in the background.
That's great. Where do you guys want to go next?
Well, at this point, we're close enough where we should probably head down to the wetland of the bridge.
All right.
So we're standing in an area of forest here, and in general, this is the very sort of typical central Massachusetts. It's called by a bunch of different names, but oak conifer forest kind of covers it in general.
Okay.
And if we look around us, we can see the characteristic species. This is white pine. That's obviously one of the conifers.
Okay.
Etc. You can see five needles, etc. If you look back in the woods here, you see this great, rather grand-looking tree, very dark, etc. And that's eastern hemlock. And this is one of the great forest giants that occurs here in Massachusetts. When you go into these very limited areas that are left now of old-growth forest, very often some of the largest trees are eastern hemlock, like this. The usual oak in this kind of forest, Worcester County, etc., is red oak.
Okay.
For no particular, it's not red for any particular sort of reason, but that's very sort of typical leaf.
And are these also some maples mixed
Yes.
in here?
This kind of place would have typically maybe some sugar maples
Okay.
in the colder spots, in the same kind of, the hemlock typically grows in fairly cold spots, and there's a sugar maple in back here already kind of turning yellow.
Yeah.
But this forest, what we're seeing here is a forest it's a fairly young forest.
These trees are not big.
That's right, except for this hemlock and this white pine, and you can see they're growing up above these hardwood trees, which is what basically happens when you see white pines in the landscape. Very often they're a sign of where there was a settlement or a house or something before. They are they're encouraged by sunlight, and the white pines grow up, and then gradually, and they create shade, and then the hardwoods, the oaks and the maples and the ashes, grow in that shade, and you can see that sort of starting to go on here. But this is a fairly recent. This area, as you were pointing out, is quite young. And there are various signs. There's bracken fern growing out along the edge of the path. And then if you look at this pretty tree where the leaves are shimmering, the yellow leaves.
Yes.
This is a poplar, a quaking aspen, it's sometimes called. And the leaves are attached in such a way that when the wind blows, they do this wonderful sort of jiggling kind of motion. And this is another tree. It's a very fast-growing tree, and it's another species that comes in very rapidly after there's been a fire. So you can look around at this landscape and make some educated guesses about what's going on here.
Colin, why is there a bridge here in the middle of the marsh?
There's a bridge here because of the Snowbird Snowmobiling Club of Lester and Spencer. And one of the neat parts about them is that when they're coming through the site, they only come through when there's a lot of snowpack. So their impact on the site that you see in front of you is fairly minimal because everything is mostly frozen and has died back. On the other hand, during the summertime, we have the benefit of their bridge.
Yeah, this is a great example of what's special about this property. If we look around, we can see a whole spectrum of different habitats. You can see the oak conifer forest in the background with the white pines and the oaks sticking up above. You can see this transition area with the gray birches with the small leaves, which is characteristic of that sort of middle ground. You can see these bright orange and red trees are red maples, and they're the characteristic species of a different forest type, sometimes called swamp forest, sometimes called red maple forest, with a whole bunch of different species that like that particular habitat. And that's a forest type that likes to have its feet wet most of the time and is flooded for part of the year and then dries out sort of in the late summer. And then coming right down to this stream edged by cattail marsh. So it's really a fantastic combination of things, and this is exactly the kind of place that's ideal for a reserve, for conservation land, because there's so much species diversity. This kind of little slow stream and marsh, very good for a wide variety of species of dragonflies and damselflies. Here's a very attractive shrub, attractive and also kind of useful. This is a winterberry. It's a kind of holly. Which, you can kind of recognize the berries. The leaves are not like the Christmas holly. That's a different species. Yeah. But this is a very important tree. The berries start ripening at this time of year, quite soft and very, very nutritious, and very, very important for wintering birds, things like robins, bluebirds that overwinter here, and thrushes and various other birds really gobble these berries up. They're so popular that usually by December, January, they're gone. The trees are denuded because they're so popular with the birds. Very, very pretty tree.
What are all these paths from through here?
These are cart paths, and they would have been for two things. The first of which is to link the different agriculture fields together so the farmers could actually go back and forth. And the second is for logging. A number of these paths that you'll come across in the woods sort of head off into a wonderful stand or into a wetland area, and all of a sudden they just simply stop. And that would be where they finished doing a cut, they would have loaded up the logs and headed back. So you have this fun network of interconnections between the different fields, and then these sort of dead-end spurs that would have been used for logging.
So these are old.
These are very old. In fact, this farm itself goes a long way back. I wouldn't at all be surprised if some of the paths we're walking right now couldn't easily be 150 years old.
You come out of the dark hemlock forest and out into the sort of open woodland with the beaches and stuff, and the whole, your kind of mood changes. It's quite striking. Yeah. This is American chestnut.
Okay.
And a lot of people know this story, but we talked about the hemlock adelgid early, and this is another story where this was one of the major constituents of our New England forest, with large trees, growing, 40 feet high or whatever. And it was wiped out, again, by the accidental introduction of a fungus. And so now, in our forest, we still have chestnuts. They still grow, but and some of them will even get mature enough to bear some nuts, but they never reach sort of forest size. Now, some people foresee that eventually they will, and there are a lot of people working on hybridization and looking at places in North America where they were resistant to this chestnut blight, but it shows you the level of change that can occur, a huge level of change, based, partly on human behavior. At one time, you'd walk through this forest and it would have been, perhaps dominated by American chestnut, and now this is kind of, we only have this vestige of it.
Maybe 7 feet tall. If it's lucky.
Yeah, it would have been part of the canopy, one of the canopy species, basically back in as late as, I think, maybe the 20s or something like that. So.
In the local area, you'll notice that there are a lot of mill buildings. And inside the mill buildings, the structural supports that run back and forth are more often than not actually big chestnut beams. And when you look at them, it's not unusual to find a 12 or 15-inch wide beam that runs the length of a building. And it gives you a sense of the trees that were growing here that were chestnut.
How long ago was this area logged, do you think?
Oh, I would say 30, 40 years, somewhere in that ballpark.
Yeah, not much more than that, I wouldn't say, looking at the size of the trees.
So this is a pretty young forest through here. This oak tree has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 stems.
And oak trees don't naturally grow multiple stems. They grow one stem. The only time you'll get multiple stems out of an oak tree is when it's been cut flush as a stump as part of a cutting operation. And then all these little sprouts grow up around the outside of the stump, and they compete to be the main stem. And if you give it long enough, the lesser ones will slowly die back and fall off, and you'll usually end up with 2 or 3 main stems that make up the tree. Right now, they're still fighting it out like young kids in a family to figure out who's going to be the big boss.
What happened to this tree? It's like
This is a beaver, and what ends up happening with the really large trees the beavers will use for dams is they'll go around and they'll cut that outside edge. And you remember all the life of the trees in that thin xylem and phloem layer that goes around the outside. So what they're doing is girdling it. So they'll cut around the outside edge, it will kill the tree, and they'll basically sit back. Come back a couple years later, the tree will fall over and they'll drag it over to the water and use it for what they want. But it's much easier than having to cut through the whole thing.
that's the lazy man's technique.
Up here, you can actually make out the individual sort of tooth marks on it.
That's pretty great.
Cutting away at stuff.
Good.
The extra.
It's been busy.
And one of the reasons that the town of Spencer's been down here is because they've been keeping an eye on the beavers. There's a pond in the northwest corner of the property, and they've been keeping track of beaver activity because there is a town water line that runs through the property.
Ah.
So they've been watching the beavers, watching the beaver dams, and it's clear that the beaver is currently present and chopping away. The fun part at this point would be that the beaver, if you cut something down, would use these as roads to move the logs back and forth.
Well, these little swampy areas.
Absolutely. In many cases, they'll not only do that, but they'll actually pull it up. If you look on the edges there, see how the mud has been patted to the side?
Sure.
The beaver will actually create canals. And
Oh,
when they
really?
take down branches, they'll actually run them along these water roads to wherever it is that they're building their structures.
So out here by this pond, we see some ducks, and we see a beaver lodge over here. That's pretty great. What kind of ducks do we find in a pond like this?
Well, at this time of year, as the fall moves on, there are, any of a dozen species that might occur here on migration. One of the most interesting ducks that nest in a place like this is something called a wood duck. It's one of our most spectacular duck species with bright iridescent color on the heads of the males and a red bill, etc. And these are ducks that nest in trees. They nest in the old days, they would nest in nest in like old woodpecker holes made by the great big pileated woodpecker. And they pick a tree that's out over water so that when the young hatch, the young ducklings, they just plop out of the hole and right down into the water where they don't get hurt and will be relatively sort of secure. So these wood ducks were hunted out at a given period in our history here, but people figured out, in order to bring them back, that they could make birdhouses, essentially, wood duck boxes, and site them in places like this, and the wood ducks would take to them. So that now wood ducks have really come back, and they're really one of our commoner native ducks nesting in this kind of wetland habitat.
And we see a ton of trees around here that have been chopped down, cut by these beaver, right?
Yep.
And this is their lodge. So there's probably beaver living in there.
Yes, yeah. Beavers are typically active at sort of early in the morning and in the evening. That's when they're kind of most active.
Sure.
So at this time of day with bright sunlight,
They're hiding
you're not
out.
likely to see them. They're in the lodge or whatever, but they're around.
Is this a stone wall?
Absolutely. These would be the stone walls that would be out at the edges of the fields.
Okay.
And
Does that mean we are coming up on a
big
field?
hill right here. And we're also coming up on a segment of the Mid-State Trail.
Whoa, the Mid-State Trail. This goes from...
Rhode Island all the way up to New Hampshire. And it goes right through central Massachusetts, and it passes through Leicester and Spencer along the way. And this project and this property would have the opportunity to protect a section of the Mid-State Trail.
That's awesome. So here, as predicted, is a field, and it's a lot taller of a field.
Absolutely. This is one of the overgrown fields that stretches across the Warner farm all the way down to Greenville Street. And these fields are a real opportunity. They have a little bit of wildlife which goes on in them right now, but because of how tall they are and because of the species that there are, there isn't an awful lot of species that are making use of this. If we were to turn this either into a haying field or we were to turn this into sort of a low brushy meadow that you went after and paid attention to breeding season, this could be an enormous opportunity for wildlife habitat. So when we look at this, you may not see an awful lot presently in terms of wildlife, but as conservationists, we look at this and see an enormous opportunity. Just acres and acres of potential field habitat. So these fields are running north off of Greenville Street.
Okay.
And over on this side, you've got a stone wall, and on the opposite side of the stone wall, heading down slope, is the sanctuary by Mass Audubon called Burncoat Pond.
Okay.
In fact, where we were with the wood ducks in the two beaver lodges is right over in the area where the Burncoat Pond Sanctuary and the Sibley Warner Farm properties come together. Also, to the north of that, Leicester has a recreation area.
Oh.
And as a result, if we were to protect this, you would have a block of land which would be in excess of 500 acres. And that's really substantial and significant for habitat.
Oh, yeah.
Well, guys, thanks for showing me around.
This is really a unique piece of land, and that it has high significance for wildlife value and just the New England landscape. So I certainly hope that it can be preserved.
And thank you very much for taking a walk with us out at the Sibley Warner Farm, and we hope to see you soon.